Yeah. Good morning. Is this loud enough? Yeah. Good morning. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Board, and today is Tuesday, May 19th, right? At 9:10 a.m. Sorry for the delay, and the meeting's called to order. With me are, to my left, Vice Chair Fran Spivey Weber. To her left, Board Member Didi Diadamo. To my right, Board Member Tam Dodak. And to her right, Board Member Stephen Moore. Mr. Howard, hi. Will you introduce the staff that's assisting you this morning?
Thank you. To my right, Karen Turgovich and John Bishop, Chief Deputies. To my left, Michael Laufer, Chief Counsel, and assisting the board are Janine Townsend and Courtney Davis.
For those of you who do not know the emergency evacuation procedures for this building, look for the exit nearest you. If you hear an emergency sound, I guarantee you'll know it's an emergency sound. Pick up your stuff, take your friends, proceed cautiously out of the building, and if you want to know when the all clear sounds, you can convene with us near the corner of 10th and J. So that's important. Second thing is the meeting is being webcast and recorded. So that means that when you come up to the microphone, it's important to get close enough to that microphone that you can be heard not just by us, but by the people in the back of the room and the people listening over the web. There are many of them. They listen. They give us feedback. So don't get too close to it, which is what I used to tell people to do. If you get too close to it, it creates a little static pop, which if you're saying something scintillating that you want to have on the radio, will not be hearable on the radio. So it's important. That's for you, Craig, if you're listening. The other thing to know is that if you have phones or pagers or other things, do people have pagers anymore? Maybe they do. Anything that makes noise, please turn it to silent or off. And with that done, we're on to the public forum, which is the time at which we hear from members of the public who wish to speak on an item that is not on our agenda for the day. And we have one speaker this morning, Roy Hogard. Or Hoggard. Tell me if I pronounced it right. Okay. Well, that's flexible of you. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Thank you for letting me speak. My name is Roy Hogard. I'm an artist, designer, and sometimes inventor. I live in Stockton, and we're suffering the drought. Last week in your office, I left you a little piece of plastic and some information on how to save water. And I would like to give one to everyone here. And it just fits on your toilet handle and ask you, do I need to flush? We flush nearly 1 billion gallons of drinking water in California every day. On a chart that I have here, shows 11 towns that are just about out of water. And if they flushed one time less, they saved millions. If they did that every month, we wouldn't be having the problems we have now. We're draining our groundwater way too fast. So that, and I have a series of questions. I left one with you. I have a few more, if anybody would like, the board, on the governor's funding for public announcements. What happened to that money? You know, this was last year when he was at Fireball. He said some $6 million for public awareness. There's nothing. Okay. One is, what are our hydroelectric capabilities going to be? Lake Mead and Lake Powell are nearly empty. We're going to be burning more fossil fuels. I have samples for everybody, and I'll hand them out in the back of the room of the plastic device. Which?
With the clerk, because I want to see it.
I will.
I appreciate it. I've been avoiding talking
about
flushing.
I wouldn't mind speaking again.
About showers and lawns, but yeah. I talked about flushing in the 90s, so I'm glad you are.
Thank you.
Also, you should know that for the public awareness, go to saveourwater.com, but the governors may revise added millions for it, so you'll start seeing more visibility at the state level, too.
Well, one of the things is that we go on and have PSAs in several languages with some humor, and how to brush your teeth on a glass of water, how not to flush the toilet so much, how to water your lawn with a timer, all those things. There's hundreds of ways. I've asked for funds to set up with high school kids to make some PSAs. And I think we should be introducing everything we can through the schools. Kids get home and talk to their parents about conservation much more than their parents pay attention. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have a lot of these.
Speaking our language, thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, moving on. That's a good way to start the day. Next, we're on to minutes of the April 21st and May 5th and 6th board meeting.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Additions or corrections? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Got it. Minutes are approved. Next, we have items 2 and 3 are uncontested items. I see a lot of people here for them. I hope it won't hurt your feelings if they stay uncontested. Do we have any cards? Oh, meaning if necessary. All right, what's your pleasure?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great, they are carried. Thank you so much. We would love to hear about it. I don't hope your feelings aren't hurt if we don't, but you did a nice job on this, so thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right, on number 4. What? 3 out of change sheet? Mr. Laufer?
Yes, it did. It was circulated so that it was part of the notice. However, just for clarity, all the board members were voting with the change sheet on item number 2. Is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent.
All right. We good? All right.
Hi, I'm Kathy Maroka. I'm Program Manager for the Enforcement Section, and I'm providing the drought update today. Now, tomorrow's workshop has an item on curtailments, so this will be a very brief item today, and we'll have a much larger item for you tomorrow. So I wanted to tell you that we're always meeting with the stakeholder groups before we take any actions on curtailments. Last week, we met with the San Joaquin Watershed Stakeholder Group because we are considering curtailment of pre-1914 water rights. That group asked us to do additional modeling so that we could increase their comfort level. We did that modeling. We provided 2 additional graphs for them as a result of that modeling. The other item, we have a temporary urgent change petition for Merced Irrigation District that we approved on May the 12th. So with that, I hold the rest for tomorrow.
Questions or for today?
I just want to thank you for the additional time you all have spent on the stakeholder meetings. I've been calling into them, and it's been a good dialogue, and staff has been responsive to the suggestions about additional information and analysis of the data.
Well,
So
we're
thank
glad
you.
to work with everybody, so.
Chair Marcus, if I can just add as well that yesterday the Office of Administrative Law approved the conservation regulations. So we had originally anticipated it would be Friday the 15th, but it was actually yesterday. OAL's approval is about to be posted to our website, and we'll also be posting additional materials this week. So I wanted to make sure to include that in the drought update as well.
Is this not working? There you go. Don't you have webinars planned with the agencies as well? Just 'cause-
How could I forget? We have 2 webinars coming up, 3 actually, 2 days, 3 webinars. The first one is this week on the 21st, and you can get information on our website or the governor or the Aqua's website as well. And the webinar this week is on aspects of the executive order and conservation unrelated to the conservation regs.
Rest of it, good.
So it's the rest of it will be the first webinar. The second webinar is on the morning of the 26th, and that will be for the urban water suppliers, the larger water suppliers, and we will focus on implementation of the regulations representatives at that time. We will also provide an update on the water pricing and some related issues. And then in the afternoon on the 26th, we're doing a dedicated webinar just for the smaller water suppliers, since the changes are, while limited, unique to those suppliers. And this is the first time that they've really had an opportunity to interact with us on a more routine basis.
Well, I think that's great, and that will help with folks who still have some confusion about what it is we're requiring. Yesterday, I won't share it now, but I'll share some of the things that some of the large water agency board members seem to think we're doing, which is not what we're doing. So it's great that you're doing the webinar with Aqua. That should help to spread the issues so that at least when people are disagreeing with us, they're disagreeing with us based on reality rather than on some figment of somebody's imagination. So I thank you for putting in the time for all that.
In addition, this week, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, the LPA is meeting with the Division of Drinking Water, and they do a lot of work with the smalls. So they should know about this webinar if they don't already.
We emailed the information on the webinar to the entire database, I think, in the SWRCB system. So all of the small suppliers, and I believe it will be announced as well.
But these are the county people who work with.
That's a good point. I'll make
I
sure to
think
get
they're
the
over in Klamath, and so just letting them, passing out a flyer at that meeting would be good.
Other questions? We'll spend a fair amount of time on a lot of this tomorrow, but thank you for all the really hard work. The whole team has been extraordinary. All right. We're on item number 5. Oh.
So
Connie,
Joe
too?
Karkowski and Stephen Westhoff are going to present this item. It's consideration of proposed resolution delegating authority to administer the cleanup and abatement funding for the disadvantaged communities that was set aside in the emergency budget back a month or two ago.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. My name is Joe Karkowski. I head up the bond section in the Division of Financial Assistance. So as Mr. Howard pointed out, the drought emergency legislation passed in March includes $15 million for drought-related emergencies or threatened emergencies and $4 million for interim emergency drinking water to disadvantaged communities with contaminated drinking water. And the funds come from our cleanup and abatement account, which is where our fines and penalties end up. The adoption of this resolution would delegate authority to approve or deny projects to the Executive Director and the Deputy Director of the Division of Financial Assistance for funding requests of $500,000 or less. We figure that projects that are more than $500,000 really should either go to the board, or it might be a project that's a better fit for a Prop 1 grant or a state revolving fund loan. We also have some funding guidelines we're asking you to adopt, and these largely mirror guidelines that were established by the Department of Public Health last year for the $15 million in general funds that they had for emergency drinking water. We made some changes to reflect different eligible entities and to incorporate some lessons learned. So the folks that are eligible are defined in the water code, and this was changed a bit by the emergency legislation. So public agencies, tribal governments that serve disadvantaged communities, as well as nonprofits that serve disadvantaged communities. And one of the new items is that community water systems that serve disadvantaged communities are eligible. So that was not previously the case with the cleanup and abatement account. The eligible projects are pretty broad. We give examples in the guidelines. We're not trying to limit eligibility beyond what's limited in the statute. So both interim solutions such as bottled water vending machines can be funded, as well as permanent solutions such as a replacement well or connection to a public water system. We did want to specify ineligible projects, such as those that are not addressing a drinking water emergency, or projects that can be funded by other means. There are a number of factors that will guide our funding decisions, such as evidence that there's a drinking water emergency, that the recipient has implemented water conservation measures, that they have a schedule for completing the project and a spending plan, and also we'll look at what other sources might be available, sources of funding that might be available. There are a number of ways that requests for funding can come in. So the Division of Drinking Water District offices often receive requests and assist folks in applying for funds. They can go through our online FAST application, and we also have a dedicated email address and phone number. We are coordinating with the Department of Water Resources and other state agencies, since a number of us have emergency drought funding. So DWR has about $5 million to assist systems with less than 15 connections and private well owners. We have a fact sheet and a press release, so the fact sheet's at the back of the room. We'll be working with the Division of Drinking Water to conduct outreach, putting out LIRIS notices, having conference calls, and then have the district offices distribute the information to their local contacts. So with that, we recommend that you adopt the resolution, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions? We have one speaker card. Omar Carrillo, Community Water Center. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Chair and members. I'm here in support, and I wanted to come forward to speak on this item for many reasons. First of all, just wanted to commend staff in getting the previous resource, similar like resource, out. And I know that a lot of times the money doesn't get out, and it got out and it actually was focused in some of the neediest communities. And also, we also do have some recommendations moving forward, because it's very, very complicated, and primarily for the private well communities, that a lot of which we work with. It's really complicated because for many reasons. First and foremost, there's really a lack of, the amount of resource even here is not enough to cover the needs of these private well communities. And we all know that most of them do not qualify for, well, many of them do not qualify for any public resource. If you're a renter, for instance, you're at a further disadvantage, because then there's situations in East Porterville, which we all know it's like the epicenter of the worst thing that can happen in terms of complete water loss. And a lot of folks are getting big tanks in front of their homes for water. That water many times is not potable water. And those are the lucky ones. The unlucky ones that are out of water aren't yet getting anything. And so at the end of the day, we need to be real creative. And part of what our recommendation is just, there's a lot of collaboration that can happen between the drinking water staff at the State Water Board, and I know DWR also has a similar program for private well owners, and not one group is going to be able to do it on their own, and also not stepping in each other's toes. There's also a lot of information sharing. So we believe that whereas in Tulare County there's a good understanding of, there's been 1,000 well failures, of which 700 are domestic wells. You ask that same question of other counties, and nobody is collecting this information, and that means there's people all throughout the state that actually are not getting accounted for. It's very possible that that funding that we're talking about here and also at DWR can be targeted at those individuals who have lost their water, right? So if we don't have that information on both ends and collaboration, it's going to be very difficult to get it to the most vulnerable communities. I know I'm out of time, but we definitely also believe that we're also willing to participate, and maybe possibly participating in some sort of convening with drinking water staff, maybe DWR, with some of those very local groups in the Central Valley that are trying to provide and address this issue of water loss, complete water loss. So you have like the self-helps and the county of Tulare and other folks. So we'd be willing to work with you all to set that up so there's a complete understanding of like who is slipping through the cracks, because there's many, many, many communities that are still slipping through the cracks, even with the allocation of this resource.
No, thank you, Mr. Carrillo. I think part of it is that we do the public water supply systems, and then you have DWR and OES. And Dee Dee and I were just at a drought task force meeting where we were talking between them. Also, OPR is engaged, the rural, Debbie, with the rural outreach. And so there is a need to understand. I think some folks understand who does what, but I don't think it's as broadly understood. And OES does work through the counties. So if the counties aren't stepping up to do that job, we end up in a bit of a pickle. So I think we may well take you up on that offer.
Thank you.
There's a need for a greater comprehension and also having it in writing intelligibly so people can know where to go.
Yeah, it's so complicated on the ground that really folks in the room, even if you're thinking OES is doing something, it's very possible that they're thinking somebody like DWR is doing it. And that's
No,
really
or that the county's doing it when the county's getting the money all from
Right.
OES.
Correct,
And so
100%.
I've had people ask, where's the state? And it's like, well, who do you think is paying for that water that you talked about the county giving you? It's the state. So not an issue of credit, but there is a need for people to understand the level of effort that's happening and for us to understand where we need to put more effort.
Well, where does the information come from that Tulare knows that others don't?
Well, you have, for instance, it's if you have a well failure, they're reporting it. So if you're an individual, you can actually call somebody at Tulare County. They tabulate, they actually have that information on a website. And so right now you can go and find out like current month to month how many communities have run out of water or how many well failures, and then they'll distinguish between domestic and agricultural. And then they'll show how many have actually been able to get their water source back. So for instance, if you're out of water and if you're a domestic user and it's for your home, if for instance, some of these resources, as I understand them, are going to go to some of, because you can, it's not, I know we're public water systems, but some of this money can get to the private well owners if the county sponsors them or an NGO, for instance. But if we don't know, for instance, in Stanislaus, there might be 1,000 well failures. They may all be domestic, and we don't know that. And that's really, that is something that we need to figure out and talk about. And like I said, I do feel that there's a lot of back and forth, like, well, who's doing what? And that's why I feel that Community Water Center can play a role in bringing people into the room and be able to have a common understanding of the limitations of this resource versus DWR's resource versus the limitations the counties have, and also really to hold people accountable, because if you're making this resource available and if a county or another local organization, we're not taking advantage, or maybe there's just a disconnect as well. So I think at the end of the day, that's something else to add. But that's where people are getting it from. They're just calling in, or the OES representative locally will do that as well, or Community Water Center will call, or they can call 211 at the county, and that information will be put into a database. So that's another way it's happening there.
That's helpful, and thank you for that offer as well.
Well, thank you for your comments, and I just want to better understand what you're suggesting on putting together a group. So are you looking in particular on the southern part of the valley or in other areas as well?
The loop?
Putting together a group.
Right. No, and it could be, I think personally, so for instance, the money from last year from the drought resource is out, and it was put into place. Some systems came out online. There was emergency resource, but some places didn't take advantage of any of that resource. Didn't apply. And my recommendation, and the counties and region. So for instance, if a lot of this went to Tulare and Kern, which is what I actually saw happen, but there's also a need in Stanislaus. There's also a need, and I know the drought is impacting the entire state as well. So I would say my recommendation. I don't have all the answers, and actually I would work. If given the opportunity, we would love to work with staff to do that. We can just set it up, maybe in Visalia, maybe in Tulare, Fresno, wherever it is, and it could just really be coming forward and saying, these are the resources that are available, but for private well owners especially, there has to be a kind of a sponsorship to some extent, right? You have to have a local county or a local NGO or tribe take initiative and actually ask for that resource. And I don't necessarily think that people are doing that, and maybe there's a misunderstanding of how complicated it is. So there may be lessons learned even from Tulare, who actually had a bottled water program at $500,000 that actually is available for private well owners, right? And that is, so if you're a private well owner who ran out of water, you may not have potable water, you may not have water going into your home, which is a travesty, but you may have bottled water delivered to your home free of charge. That is something that could be used as an example of what other counties can do, and at minimum, you don't have this call to someone and nobody answers, or there's just not an accounting for it.
So what I would suggest is we have, and I think you're going to be participating, the Partnership for the San Joaquin Valley is having a drinking water forum on the 19th. I think it's the 19th of June. And we'll have full participation from our staff. The Division of Drinking Water will be there, the Division of Financial Assistance, and then there will be officials from all 8 of the San Joaquin counties, San Joaquin Valley counties. And so maybe we should connect prior to that, so that whatever you're thinking in terms of follow-up with, a more detailed maybe work group could be rolled out at that date. Or if you're not ready yet, if we're not ready yet, then it would be an opportunity to get some ideas, because there'll be elected officials from each of the counties as well as public works directors.
Okay, thank you for that. That sounds good. Definitely.
June 19th, let me double check here.
Thank you for the offer. I clearly need to have you looped in, but also to review. We clearly need at minimum a one-pager on who does what and who ought to do what, but it's more than that. It's a conversation.
And empowering the practitioners, because on the ground it's a little bit different. It sounds a little bit different, so even staff and all the folks on the ground that are doing it would be helpful.
Thank you, as always. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I checked, it's June 19th, and we're doing a tour the day before on the 18th. And Agita Kapaya is working on that.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Next, oh wait, have we done anything? We haven't done anything.
I move we adopt the resolution.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Hey, carries. Thank you for the good work, and thank you for the great suggestions, Mr. Correa. All right, item 6 is going to be, wait just a second, be a relatively long item, so I suggest we take a 10-minute break before we start. Are we up? All right, thank you all. Sorry that went longer than intended. Good morning, Mr. Borkovich.
Morning, Chair Marcus.
All right. We'll proceed with item number 6.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, fellow board members. My name is John Borkovich. I am the Groundwater Monitoring Section Chief here at the State Water Resources Control Board. I'm joined here today with Jana Sinke, our Unit Chief for Oil and Gas Monitoring, and also Eric Gilman with the Office of Chief Counsel. And go ahead to the next slide, please. So today, the workshop, we've got a slide coming up here, bear with us. There we go. Is that we'll go through the introductions now and then to do an overview of the workshop this morning, and we'll have a statement from the supervisor from the Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Resources, Steve Bolin, Dr. Steve Bolin, and then we'll turn it back over to Janice to do an overview of the draft model criteria, and then we'll get stakeholder input. We're joined today by Clean Water Action and other folks from EJ. They'll make a presentation on their input since they were cited in the legislation as stakeholders. And then also oil and gas will be represented as well. Then we'll turn it over to public comment after that, and then open it up for board member discussion. So at this point, I'd like to call up Dr. Steve Bolin, the supervisor for the Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Resources.
Welcome and thanks for joining us.
Morning. Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Steve Bolin. I'm the State Oil and Gas Supervisor and the head of the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources. What I thought I would do this morning is very briefly talk about the magnitude of the activities that are occurring in well stimulation, hydraulic fracturing in the state, and then talk a little bit about the work that the Water Board and the division are doing together. It seems I've been almost a year in state service. It's been a tumultuous year, and I find myself spending a lot of time with the Water Board and enjoying the work we're doing together very cooperatively. Since the SB4 interim regulations went into effect January 1st of last year, we have received some 1,500 completed notices to conduct well stimulation operations. That doesn't mean that that's how many wells have been stimulated in the state, because operators have up to a year to conduct their well stimulation operations. Of those 1,562 notices that have been completed, there have been 809 well stimulation operations conducted. There have been 22 groundwater monitoring plans that have been approved by the division with concurrence from the State Water Board. And the pace from last year and the pace for this year looks like it's continuing. So we probably expect to see that total that I just read you is through April. So that includes the first third of this year. But we see a fairly steady pace. Obviously, there's a lot of concern about water. And I just thought I would mention that one of the advantages of SB4 is that we now have the amount of water for well stimulation activities reported to us. And if I look back for last year, for the total year, and look at the sum total of water that was used, what's not known, we'll have to wait to see from 1281, how much of this water was actually cleaned up, produced water. But it looks like we used a little over 200 acre-feet of water for well stimulation activities. So that's a big number if you do it in gallons, but considering the state withdrew 14 million acre-feet of water from aquifers last year, 200 puts that in context. Finally, the Water Board and the division have been working very closely together on developing the criteria for groundwater monitoring plans. The board has, the board staff have listened very carefully to our concerns and incorporated our concerns. So I would describe our relationship with the Water Board staff as excellent. We discuss a lot of hard issues. and I think do so in a way that's effective. And I'm very pleased that we have such a good working relationship. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. Otherwise, I'll be happy to sit down.
Well, thank you for joining us and for the collaborative relationship. Thank you also for taking this job. Challenging. I know people have been we're very happy to see you arrive.
Hey, good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. Our presentation today will start with a general background on SB4. And then we will update you on the project timeline for developing the model criteria. But the bulk of the conversation, the presentation will be presenting the details on the draft model criteria. So Dogger released their draft regulations back in January 2013. There weren't groundwater monitoring requirements associated with those. There was public concern about potential groundwater contamination from hydraulic fracturing. So due to that, Senate Bill 4 was passed in late 2013. And as Steve Bolin said, we've been working very closely with Dogger to implement the provisions of SB 4 since 2014. Having a hard time with that one. There you go. I think it might need batteries. So this is a detailed list of some of the provisions that the Water Board are doing in regards to SB4. Consulting with Dogger during development of the regulations, entering into a formal agreement. Today, we will be focusing on the highlighted, which is developing the model criteria for groundwater monitoring. Oops.
John, why don't you let us go ahead and do it right for you?
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Let us know when you're on the next slide.
This is good. The model criteria as outlined in SB4 is to include monitoring criteria for operator groundwater monitoring near stimulated wells, and also regional scale monitoring that'll be conducted by the State Water Board. Next, please. So the team that we have had to develop the draft model criteria, similar to what we did for the nitrate report to the legislature, our expert, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, has provided us with draft recommendations for the model criteria. We have developed the draft model criteria based on those recommendations and in consultation with Dogger and feedback from stakeholders and the public. And Lawrence Livermore will be issuing their final report in late June to us. Also, since there's very little information available out there regarding groundwater quality and well stimulation or oil and gas activities, USGS has been collecting and analyzing information to help also develop the model criteria. Next, please. Thank you. So SB4 has mandated specific deadlines for the development and implementation of the model criteria. Next, please. Thank you. So we kicked off the process by hosting 2 public stakeholder meetings last August in Bakersfield and Los Angeles. Last December, our lead expert, Lawrence Livermore, hosted a public meeting with other experts to hear from the public and stakeholders as well. We recently released our draft model criteria on April 29th for a 30-day public comment period. And then, of course, today's workshop offers an opportunity to receive board member feedback and hear from the public and stakeholders again. So moving forward, May 29th will be the end of our public comment period. Water Board is scheduled to adopt final model criteria on July 7th. Prior to that, we will release the final draft, or the draft final model criteria for a 10-day public comment period from June 19th to June 29th. And then, as we stated before, the State Water Board will begin implementation of the regional component of it next January. So next, we'll give you a brief summary of the model criteria itself, the draft model criteria. So the protected water is defined in the draft model criteria as water with less than 10,000 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids. It's within an aquifer of sufficient volume, so it can yield at least 200 gallons a day, and it's outside of an exempted aquifer. It's very similar to what we had in the interim regs for the definition of protected water. The only difference is now that we have added that the aquifer is to yield sufficient volume. So there's 4 main elements of the draft model criteria. The first area is the operator area specific groundwater monitoring. Next, there's a section on requests for exclusion. There are cases where area specific groundwater monitoring is not required, and I'll go over that. There's also a portion for designated contractors sampling and testing, and the regional groundwater monitoring is also included. Next, please. Oops, there you go. So an area-specific groundwater monitoring plan can be developed for a single well to be stimulated or a group of wells to be stimulated. And I have some figures I'll show you how that works. Water supply wells that are local and regional monitoring program wells can possibly be used if they're approved by the State Water Board. And the monitoring wells are to be located within a half a mile from the well undergoing stimulation. And if it's a lateral stimulation, it'll be a half a mile from the zone, the surface projection of the zone of stimulation. So here in the following slides are a few examples of how the monitoring network would be comprised. So here's a single well, and you can go to the next one. There's groundwater flow direction that the operator will have to assess in the area. So, and you can keep clicking, this is layers. So at a minimum, 1 upgradient and 2 downgradient monitoring wells will be required for each protected aquifer that is penetrated by the stimulated well.
Can this may be in the materials that aren't in the PowerPoint, but how did you decide how many of them to be? Because at least some of the comments said we didn't propose enough.
Right. Well, we do have examples of where additional wells may be required, but at a minimum, 3 wells will help you assess groundwater gradient, any changes in groundwater gradient. Also, the upgradient well poses as a background well potentially. So that is the reasoning behind that, to gather groundwater flow direction data and to help establish baseline or background.
The 3 is a minimum, not a
Right,
maximum.
that's a minimum.
Is it a minimum that our staff can require more from, or is it a minimum up to the operator to decide?
It's up to the staff. If we show another example, I think it might, you might answer your question in the next slides, where there are times where multiple or additional monitoring wells would be required.
But let me jump in and just say that we have been using a very similar approach throughout the last 30 years in groundwater monitoring for where we have a known source of discharge, like a leak or a spill. You start with an upgradient and 2 downgradient wells so that you can make sure that you get a signal down gradient of that, and then you have enough with 3 to ensure that you put them in the right place. If the groundwater gradient changes or if it was assumed in the wrong place, then you know that with 3, and you would add additional if you have a problem.
That was the gist of my question, which is this based on the prior extensive practice and experience that you have with contaminant sources, since it's not the first time we've done it? That's what I was looking for. My question was, because in simple, it doesn't sound like that much, because you figure the stuff can slip by the monitoring well. And I know, I'm sure some of the commenters will talk about it, so we can talk about it more.
There's another scenario where there may be multiple wells to be stimulated, and the 3 monitoring well scenario might still work. If they're close enough in proximity, the stimulated wells, then the 3 well scenario would potentially work. The next situation would be a larger area of stimulated wells. So additional upgradient and downgradient monitoring wells would potentially be required in this case. So for larger areas, multiple upgradient and downgradient monitoring wells would be required.
And I'm presuming that some of your thinking will depend on how much you know about the groundwater flow, because it can vary. It's not linear in every place. So presumably you'd require more wells where you knew less, right?
And it's very dependent, site-specific on geology and hydrogeology. There could be faults for, geologic formations that would allow.
Localized pumping also has an effect on groundwater flow direction.
Are these wells more or less a half a mile apart in this particular setting?
Yes.
So that gives folks a sense of the probable scale, although site-specific conditions will prevail.
Exactly. So next slide. So with depth in the 3-dimension, for each protected aquifer that a well to undergo stimulation penetrates, groundwater monitoring wells will need to be installed in those protected aquifers as well. So each protected aquifer would have upgradient, downgradient wells. In addition, for any nearby water supply well, a well that's in 1 mile of the well to be stimulated, the operator will need to install a sentry or a guard monitoring well. Now, some of the wells that are installed as upgrading or downgradient wells could also be used as sentry wells. And a sentry well could monitor multiple water supply wells. So all samples collected in the area-specific groundwater monitoring would be sampled on a semi-annual basis, and the data would be uploaded to GeoTracker.
Is that in perpetuity, or is there a point where the sampling would cease after this? Because of the time scale, the fracturing event is limited. So is that something that would be negotiated on a case-by-case basis?
Well, we're required under the law to do a periodic review of the program. So that might be an issue that would be brought up at that point once we get at a point where we have a lot of data collected, and if it's, we bring it before the board for a discussion.
So this slide shows the list of analytes to be monitored. The highlighted analytes are those that have been added to the interim list that we've been using under the interim DOGGR regulations. So we've added some extra gases, some stable isotopes.
So I think to clarify, the highlighted ones are in addition to the ones that are being
Right.
required under the interim. Yeah. So this is with draft input we've had from our experts. Also, just to take a step back real quick, the 1 upgradient and 2 downgradient was also a recommendation from our experts as well.
I don't know if you can answer this without going into a lot of details, but what is the basis for all of these analytes to be monitored?
Several of these are, like I mentioned, input we have from our experts. I think that they would be better to answer that question. But I think that in general, these are analytes that help to better define if there has been a breach and potential pathway into groundwater resources in the area as a result of well stimulation activities.
I asked one of our experts to come up. Is there anything you wanted to add in terms of the basis for these analytes?
Hi.
Yeah, so what John said is essentially right. The basis for these analytes is to try to be able to attribute any kind of change in water quality that we see to oil and gas operations. So, you know, a number of things, methane occurs naturally. So the mere presence of methane doesn't mean that it's from well stimulation, for instance. By using some of these analytes, for instance, some of the longer chain gases, ethane, propane, butane, pentane, hexane, one can be able to try to, in dissolved organic, one can start to distinguish thermogenic methane from biogenic methane. Some of these are, for instance, the guar gum sugars. This is a relatively inexpensive analysis. It is one of the by mass larger additives used in well stimulation. And so its presence would be indicative that there has been some impact from stimulation. Others of these stable isotopes of oxygen, hydrogen, and water is, again, an inexpensive analysis. It can say something about the source of water, whether it's you know, formation water or whether it's coming from enhanced oil recovery or well stimulation. And then we recommended, and we'll see how this, that you know, the operator proposed 2 analytes from well stimulation additives that they have used for those specific wells. We are not recommending that all of the additives, the chemical additives used in the well stimulation, be monitored on a routine basis. I think we have provision in the recommendations for if there are statistically significant changes in water quality, then you would go back, collect more water, and then do some additional analyses that could more specifically identify, you know, what was the cause of that change in water quality.
Thank you. You should introduce yourself just for the people listening over the web.
I am Brad Esser, so I was leading the team of experts for Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today as well.
So there, excuse me, there are certain conditions where the area-specific groundwater monitoring will not be required. One is where an operator can clearly show that protected water, that the stimulated well does not penetrate protected water. And the other would be that the stimulated well is located within a boundary of an approved and fully implemented regional monitoring program.